All right. Well, yeah, this has been quite a start to things. In the spirit of virtual learning done right, go figure we have technical difficulties as we're going live. So happy Tuesday, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Learning Tech Talks, where we're talking about learning tech with a slightly different bend. Today is all about learning and collaboration, which is a big and relevant topic right now. So to help me tackle this one, I'm joined by my friends Bob Kulhan and Josh Pryor. They're from Business Improv, and we're going to be breaking down some of our best practices by sharing our career of wins and, as highlighted today, sometimes the failures that ultimately end up happening when you do this kind of stuff. So if you're joining us going live, give us a thumbs up, share the post, tag someone in who'd benefit from the conversation. And while we're getting started, while you're at it, also comment and let us know where you're joining us live from. So I'm in the ever beautiful Waukesha, Wisconsin. How about you, Bob and Josh?
I am in the burbs of New York, Montclair, New Jersey.
Okay.
And I am in Newport Beach, California.
All right. All right. So complete opposite. You know what? If you look at that, we're representing the entire country.
Yeah.
We've got both
three of the four time zones.
The Midwest. Yeah. Not too bad. Not too bad. All right. So before we get into it, before we get into the conversation, the question that we had set up was, so if you had one piece of technology from your youth, that you could not have lived without, that today your kids would be like, I don't even know what that is. What is this, a fossil? So Josh, you were first to jump to it. So I will start with you.
All right. So we're in the process of moving right now. In the last couple of weekends, we've been pulling stuff out of boxes, and my wife found like an old box of mine that's from my bachelor days. It's always moved with me, but I've never gone through. And I went through it and found my original click wheel iPod from like 20 years ago, which was a game changer when it came out. And it was 20 gigabytes. And my son is huge in it. My 11-year-old son is huge into tech. So I was like, I got to show you something. And I showed it to him. And it was like movie-esque how disappointing the reaction was. Really? Of him just being like, what is that? I was like, it's an iPod. He's like, what? And I started explaining, like, I'm like, you do the click wheel, and this is how you get to your music. And we start talking about it, and it was just like you said, a fossil. It was just like, cool. That's really super exciting, Dad. And I was like, yeah, well, but it's so 20 gigabytes, and he's like, that's like the size of an SD card now. And I'm like, okay. This is a solid try.
You don't want it.
And then my for example is like, this replaced having to carry around a disc player. And he's like, what is that? I was like, okay, all right.
You didn't have one of those in the box.
Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
Okay. How about you, Bob? What do you got?
All right. I'm going to go further old school than that. And this was actually something that I really enjoyed. I played with an awful lot, probably more than any young adult should. It's an answering machine. I used to have the clever outgoing messages and would essentially like dub in other things and like fill in the buttons, and act like a swear word. You do this and I'll boop, and then people would leave the machine. If I put that out now, they probably try to see how far they could throw it.
Okay. Interesting. It's funny. The answering machine. Wow, I wouldn't have gone there. I actually wouldn't have thought of that as like a toy, but you know what? That actually was I don't even know if you could get one of those anymore. They're probably
maybe a Radio Shack
going an answering machine. What is that? I remember you had to replace the tapes, all that good stuff. The tapes would get full, and you had the cheesy. Oh wow, that takes me back. All right, so mine is a little bit different. So I have always been kind of a computer geek, and so for me, I had a friend who was also a computer geek. And the challenge was we were always trying to, share software and things like that and all that good stuff. But the problem was back then you didn't have a thumb drive that you could throw a whole piece of software on, because 5 megabytes was big stuff. We didn't have those kind of storage devices. So I actually had software that would split up all the files so I could put in my 3.5-inch, floppy disk. And thankfully, if I had 10 3.5-inch floppy disks, we could quickly transfer these large 10 megabyte computer games across the neighborhood to one another. So yeah, I think I saw something the other day. Somebody was joking that their kid found a 3.5-inch floppy and thought that they had 3D printed a save icon. And like, no, that actually at one point was a thing. So
Yeah.
cool. Well, all right. So we are talking today about virtual learning and how to do it well. And I think this is definitely I know this is a very relevant topic right now with everything that's going on. But before we get into it, talk a little bit about, because I think people who know me know I've been doing virtual stuff for quite a long time in this space, but share a little bit about your background in terms of how you've stepped into the virtual space, both from a learning standpoint, but also just, I know your whole, organization is virtual and has been, correct?
Yes. So, well, we're, improvisation, business improv. It's up on your feet. It's experiential learning. And we're 21 years old. It's based on site for the most part. Now, 10 years ago, the writing was on the wall to go virtual. So we started experimenting with avatars and then jumped forward to Cisco systems and those giant television that you had to go to the room and work in those and go to another room and work in those. And then about 3 years ago, it all started coming together as we create custom exercises. Those began to fit inside technology like Zoom and FaceTime. And then you start getting Adobe Connect and WebEx and Zoom and all these other great platforms that allow us to play within that space. And so we've always been focusing on how to communicate and collaborate with people and create teams and culture in the virtual space. So the last 3 years, that's been our big initiative, working inside this medium and helping people connect with each other and build cohesive teams with people that trust each other and will understand what it means to get each other's backs.
Okay, got it. Well, so I got to say, one of the things you hit on there that is an important topic that I get asked a lot, right, is when it comes to the tech. And let's just blow this myth out of the water before we get into some of the, best practices, worst practices, because maybe this is actually a worst practice. Is a lot of questions come up of like, well, what platform should we use when it comes to virtual learning? Like what are the platform? What's the best? What's your top 2, top 3 or whatever? And I always get very squeamish when I am asked that question, just because it's one of those like, well, it depends, and it's an enabler, and the tech stack itself will not determine the success of the platform. So well, I certainly have a preference for different tools that I use in different situations, right? We're doing virtual collaboration right now. Mm-hmm. I don't just have like a rock solid answer of, well, you need this, and by purchasing this or using this tool, it'll work. But what's been your experience with that?
Our experience, I think, and Josh, I would love for you to jump in as well.
You can argue with me on it?
Yeah, there's one platform that I think
I
is
disagree.
better.
Actually, if you buy this platform,
it's the one that I created. The pillow sack full of washing machine parts. The only thing that I would say, if you could use this as a platform, is people. That's the one thing that everything is going to have in common beyond technology, that we all have to connect with each other. And so that to me is where our focus is. Aside from the technology, there's a lot of great technologies out there. And like you, we've worked with a lot of them to facilitate our virtual instructor-led training programs. That said, the big common theme between one platform and another platform is who's on it.
Yeah.
Right.
Who's talking with each other.
Yeah. I think it's obviously different industries have different needs. So this is a relevant question for a lot of people of what should we use. And to Bob's point, it's also easy for it to become just like a red herring, where it's like, let's just spend all of our time and effort researching what video conferencing profile is going to be the best, when at the end of the day, if it's technology focused, it's just more ways to add confusion.
Yeah.
If the team's not in the right place, if there's all these great, awesome bells and whistles and no one knows what each other are doing, or you're not collaborating, it doesn't matter, and that's really, I think it still has to be an important part, and the focus needs to be on the team and on how you're communicating in this environment before you're really focused on what are those really cool things that we can do while we're collaborating with each other.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting, I've played with just about every tool out there. And what I've found is a lot of the tech can do, right? There's not necessarily, and I deal with this on other learning tech too, not just virtual collaboration, where it's like, well, there's actually multiple platforms that probably have very similar or the same capabilities. It's more a choice of which one, fits better into, your user experience or the way you do things or what your comfort level is with a tool. Sometimes it's a matter of, is it more work for you to try and learn a new tool versus use one you're familiar with? And I think that's where you can work through some of those things versus if we again spent half as much time on actually improving the virtual experience as we did trying to pick the right tool, I think our end users would probably be a lot more grateful for that. So
right. Regardless of the technology, it's never going to make you better at something. If you spend an arm and a leg on an excellent golf club, it might give you a leg up. But if you don't take lessons or you don't learn how to use it properly, it's not going to matter.
Wicked slice,
right? You're still going to slice it. You're still going to send out dinner plates and divots. It's just it's the wrong focus.
Yeah. Well, so let's get into this, because this is one thing that I always have a engaging discussion with people on when it comes to the whole in-person versus virtual, right? There's sometimes a little bit of a us versus them or a battle between the two of, which one's better. And sometimes you'll hear well, you just can't do this virtually. So let's talk about some of the realities, because there are not necessarily no limitations, but you do have to do things differently. There are some limiting factors when you think about virtual. And I know, you put together this hack sheet, or we actually kind of collaborated on this hack sheet. So let's talk a little bit about that in terms of, what are some of these big differences that we have to recognize. It's like, hey, if you're moving into the virtual space, there are some big ones. One of the big ones being the nonverbal communication standpoint. So I know you do a lot of this now. What does that mean to you when you say, hey, there's some nonverbal stuff that you just can't read? Because there's some that I could probably kind of healthily challenge in the way some people take that too far.
Yes. Okay. So if you think about on-site communication, we have the opportunity to read nonverbal communication in a number of different ways. It could be full body or whole body. I could see even what your legs are doing, how your body's positioning. We talk a little bit more with our hands. Typically, I might be the exception as in a virtual setting. However, in person, we have a tendency to talk more with our hands. And you can also read facial expressions in a different way than you can through technology. So you have to shift and adapt. So when you're making eye contact with somebody through this medium, you have to look at the little green dot right there. Yep. And that makes it feel like it's eye contact. However, if you're going to read nonverbal communication, your eyes have to continue to look at the person or people with whom you're communicating. So there's got to be this constant state of movement. Also, you have about this much to read. You can't read. You don't know that I'm wearing a tutu under from this part down.
Pantaloons.
Yeah, pantaloons, spats and chaps. So we don't know what's happening down there. The little shifts have to become bigger through this medium. And that also means that how we communicate has to become just a little bit different through this medium as well. And then once you start adding multiple people to the picture and the screens get smaller and smaller, then it's harder and harder to read people. So that becomes exponentially more difficult. So we have to adapt to really honor and respect this medium in the way that we're forming relationships with each other and reading nonverbal communication, subtext. The intonation might have to change a little bit as well. It's just a shift in the way that we need to communicate with each other.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to, it's a skill set. And I think this is probably one of the things that people are, and one of the other things we talk about in the hack sheet, that is another one, right? Kind of the chemistry, the feeling, the general sense of how things are going. It can feel a little cold or sterile in the virtual space. And again, you're missing out on some of those nonverbals. I think the challenge is as practitioners and professionals in this space, it's about learning how to work the room, learning how to work the audience and things like that in a different way. It's not that you can't do it. It's that it's can be more challenging. You have to be more attentive to details that maybe you just took for granted. Maybe It's just like, well, I just was in the room and I just kind of knew what was going on. And maybe now you have to pay a little bit closer attention to it.
Right. And yeah, well, I mean, whether you're a leader or you're part of a team or an entrepreneur, whatever it is, making the assumption that the way that you behaved or the way, what made you successful in a live setting or in person, making the assumption that you can take that and just dump it into virtual and it's going to work perfectly is incorrect. It can, if you are engaging enough and you're willing to be open to that flexibility. And at the same time, for the overwhelming majority of people, it's a huge difference going from being able to read those nonverbals, being able to have that interpersonal strength set or skill set that gives you a strengths is challenged in the virtual setting. And it's not going to be the same. Like all the troubleshooting you might have used in live settings they're not going to work the same. It's not a one-to-one, translation.
Yeah. Well, and that gets to some of the things that we're going to dive into on some of these best practices, that it's not, starting to go into this virtual space is not about just shifting what you were doing before into the new box, right? Like, well, this is what I did before. Now I'm going to just plop it into Zoom or WebEx or GoToMeeting, or I'll make sure I list off a whole bunch of these so people don't think I'm advocating for any one of them, right? And then magically it'll be there. But before we get into that, I think the other one that we talked about was the reality of, and I actually hear this a lot with virtual collaboration outside of learning, is you do not have as much access to people outside of when the formal stuff's happening, right? And the water cooler conversations or things like that, going to lunch with one another and things, where there is just kind of this natural interaction that happens outside of the formal learning, which actually it's interesting to see that, I don't think people fully realized how important that time was until this whole COVID thing hit. And people are moving into this. They're in back to back meetings. And before, there was this natural breathing room between there that allowed you to kind of reset your brain a little bit. And now you're rolling literally from one meeting right into the next, and sometimes hard to even get up and use the bathroom, with the way things are going. So with that one, as you've looked at that, because this is one of the things that when it comes to all of these things that are realities, it's less of a matter of you can't do it. I mean, the one we didn't list that to me is just is right. You can't touch and taste things quite the same as you can in person, which is probably okay for most corporate learning events. Hugging usually is not encouraged. And whether people will even shake hands after this whole crisis comes down is right. Kind of a question mark. But are there any other ones that, I know you've done a lot of work over the years, kind of transitioning some of your programs. Are there any other ones that you've said, man, we really tried to do this and we found we had to completely rethink it?
Chemistry. You said it before, that it's not that it can't be done. It can be done. And to a great degree, it's got to be fabricated. I mean, we have to make it happen in this specific medium, because on site, you can feel like the laughter in the room, the energy of the room. You could feel if there's some underlying tension. I mean, if you're really attuned and you're kind of gelled in that EQ space, you can read the room and you can watch the room adjust in real time. Who's kind of connecting with each other, and who's pulling apart from each other. At least you can feel that tension. Whereas in this capacity, we can't add that pop unless you choose to add the pop, unless you choose to bring a little extra energy, unless you choose to know how to direct it and who's paying attention, who's not paying attention, and bring them into it. The reality, though, is with this chemistry, once the computer shuts or the phone call goes off, if we're not using this medium, you don't know exactly how the resonating impact is going to unfold. So a quick, for example, that is in a meeting, if your spidey senses are going off, and you're like, there's something going on with Josh right now. I don't know what it is. You could just say, hey, Josh, can I go, walk back to your office and we'll chat a little bit, and you can kind of keep it light and unpack it. In this capacity, though, you have to schedule that meeting, or a surprise call could, encroach upon this person who's dealing with a 5-year-old who's having a fit, or a significant other who needs the office for an important meeting, and there's only one office in the house, and who knows what's happening in each one of our entrepreneurial environments. So things have to really unfold in a different way when you're operating virtually as opposed to when you're operating on site. To your point, though, you can create chemistry, you can create energy, and it is contagious what we bring to the table.
Yeah. Well, and what you mentioned about that, that's, I think is an underlying thing that I've seen in everything virtual, whether it's learning, collaboration, whether it's, working in a remote environment, that type of stuff, is the intentionality behind what you have to be so much more intentional about everything. So even like reading the room, right? Maybe if you were facilitating a room and everybody's right there, it just kind of naturally, you could just kind of look around and it came a little more natural. In the virtual space, you have to be much more intentional about, how am I doing this? How am I watching? How am I making sure? What am I doing to bring people back in? Things like that, because I can't just rely on, I can just kind of walk a little bit closer to this person and I'll bring them back in because, now that's not going to happen. So I think that's where a lot of these challenges really do boil down to intentionality behind thinking about things, which are some of the best practices that we talk about. Even some of just the basics, like turning on your camera, is
right.
I still sometimes am absolutely flabbergasted by how frequently that practice is not just I don't even know, it shouldn't even be a best practice. It should just be like, that's what you do. But it is still for a lot of people, that's not normally how we do it. So on this end, I'm curious, because one of the things when it comes to the camera stuff, I've been doing it for so long. I used to look like a Minecraft character when I started doing this virtual stuff. But it is an adjustment for people, to see themselves, to see other people. As you've gone into that space, I'm curious, even now, how do you see participants react to it, and even your own facilitators? Is it just normal? Or when somebody's new to that comes to it, do you have to kind of help them work through that?
I think that there's a fair amount of a learning curve that has to go into it. And, it's what's funny, Christopher, is when I think the three of us collectively were introduced maybe like early last year. So it's been well over a year that we've been having conversations. You very early on, you're like, I'm a video guy. So if we're going to talk on video. And we were like, cool, let's do it. And this was a year before where we are right now. And I remember appreciating that so much, because you get to know somebody a lot more when you can put a face to the name. And I was just telling my wife the other day that we have one of our clients who's been a legacy client for probably 2 years, who I've worked with so much. I've never met in person.
Okay.
However, I've also never met before. And we had a conversation last week, and it was a video conversation that she proposed. And I was like, yeah, great. And on the call, it was this moment of like, we've been working together for so long, we've never physically met. Like, we've never met face to face. I didn't know what you looked like. I had a picture of you in my mind, but we had never actually met before. And I like, this is great. It's nice. And I think that, to go back to your question, part of that learning curve is I think a lot of it has to do with being, not to be too sappy, but just being kind to yourself.
Yeah.
And knowing that, because a lot of people, the hang up for putting video on is my setup, or I have kids, or X number of things. I'm wearing a t-shirt today, or whatever it might be. It's all these things we tell ourselves that people aren't going to I'm not going to be accepted. I'm going to be judged. That's going to make me get in my own head. Like, if I go on this Zoom call, everyone's going to be wearing a tuxedo and I'm going to be in a t-shirt, and I'm just really going to feel self-conscious. And I think it's having that room, especially for yourself, of just knowing that you're still bringing yourself to the table, and we're all in this together. It's a very strange time, all collectively. I posted earlier that between the three of us, we have 10 kids. So there's a lot of children running around in our collective households. I have
half of them, though, by the way.
You do have half of them, yeah.
Well, I count as a kid, though, so
that's true.
So we could
according to my wife,
10
anyway.
And it's like, my wife called me earlier and was like, "You're going to be on this thing." She's like, "I'll try to get the kids outside." And I'm like, "That's great if you can, and if you can't, assuming they're not right here screaming at me on camera." Which even then, we did a session a couple weeks ago, and a woman had her daughter on her lap.
Yep.
And like, we're not going to call that out. If anything, I was like, that's cool. I had a call with a consultant yesterday that we work with, and his daughter was in the background. And it's like, that's fine. Like, this is the world we're in, and there has to be room for that to take place. There has to be vulnerability, because you're not going to accept other people doing that unless you're just open to doing it yourself and being like, if that's what's going on, that's what's going on. If it doesn't impede on what we're talking about, assuming that we're not talking about some top secret thing that no one's allowed to listen to, or whatever your kids can't listen to. At the same time, it's just, there needs to be room for yourself. You need to make room for yourself to just be able to do it. And yeah, I'll stop there.
No, well, and I think the thing that you're hitting on there that has just been my experience over the years is like we in the position we're in, we set the tone for this, and we have to lead by example. So if we're awkward and uncomfortable, and if something happens and we freak out or we refuse to go on camera because our hair's not right or things like that, and we set those excuses, I mean, that's what everybody else hears, and then they go, oh well. If that's the tone, if that's the way the meetings run, then I need to follow that. Where, I mean, as a funny example, I won't mention where, but I was with one organization when I first started. I'm always on webcam. Like if you talk to me, I'm on webcam, and it was countercultural, big time. And I remember when I first started doing it, like I would literally get text messages from people in the meeting telling me, your camera's on, we can see you. and I remember emailing back thinking, well, yeah,
I know.
I mean, that's kind of the point. But the excuses kind of came, well, I can't, I just got out of the shower, or I just came out of this meeting, I didn't have my coffee, things like that. And for me, it was about really helping people understand, and again, set the tone for like, that's okay. So I took it to an extreme, actually, in that for the next almost 2 months, I stopped shaving. I stopped like literally everything. I would come to meetings, sweat stains from working out, just intentionally, so that I could almost kind of embarrass people a little bit when they would go, well, I can't come on camera and say, well, if I can look like this, you can't look worse than I do right now. And it worked, right? You almost kind of use humor to bring it around and let people know, I think, to what you said, Josh, that you're accepted as you are. You're accepted the way you're coming right now. And that's okay. You don't need to put on a veneer to be part of this meeting. I think setting that tone makes a big difference for engagement overall.
Yeah. I think you're on point with this, because with the tone, there should be expectations set as well. There's got to be that point that you say, we are going to be on camera. I don't care what you're wearing. I care what you're not wearing, potentially. However, what you're wearing, as long as you're dressed appropriately, you're focused, you're present, you're on point, you're engaged, you're not multitasking, some basic etiquette rules essentially on how we communicate with each other, then the majority of people will align, because now they know what's expected of them. And then that setting the tone is that little extra pop as a leader. Where are we? What are we doing? How are we telling everybody that, to Josh's point, it's okay. It's okay if the kid comes running in. If, I told my wife before this, it was, if there's something happening, unless it's a huge emergency, you handle it. Now, if there's something happening, come and get me. It's fine. There's not a meeting in the world that I can't say, I need to take care of this. And the people on the other end are going to be like, no, like, what? This isn't the reality anymore.
Right.
So we have to give ourselves that freedom and vulnerability to lead by example, set the tone. And then as leaders, if we're in that position, we have to guide people to let them know what we expect of them as well.
Yeah. Well, and you hit on the expectations piece, which goes back to me, that's another one of those webcam fundamentals that gets so often overlooked. We just jump to the conclusion that, well, we've invited people to the web meeting. They know they're coming to learn. And for very, very, very good reasons, a lot of people expect virtual meetings and virtual learning sessions to be an atrocity. I mean, people just almost come into it with an expectation of, my eyes are going to bleed. My ears are going to bleed a little bit too. And I'm just going to sit there and hopefully get some work done while this webinar is happening. And that's the expectation we have to recognize a lot of people have coming into that. And if we don't tell them otherwise, and then they show up, they're already showing up with the mindset of, this is what it is. This is how it's going to be. And if you try and flip that on the fly, I mean, I'll tell you just from personal experience, people don't adapt well when they're planning to get some work done while they're doing this. And suddenly they realize, oh, I'm not going to be able to do that right now.
Yeah.
Well, I think that goes back as well. I think you're right. I mean, from what I've heard from a lot of people is that, watching a webinar is kind of like watching a Bob Ross special.
Yeah.
That just goes on for like an hour or 90 minutes. It's like, that's good the first, block of time. Then after a while, you're like, oh, yeah, pushes. Yeah, paint the clouds, paint the mountains.
Right.
Yeah, it's that intentionality that you mentioned before that set the tone. I mean, if you want this to be a little bit more dynamic than just a monotone, metronome, just going back and forth, then it's up to us to say, all right, we're going to do this in a different way.
Yeah.
And then other people are like, okay, what are you going to do?
Yep. And the thing with it that I've seen is that the first time, and this is where I think sometimes we just need to continue being a little bit relentless with it, is that the first time you do it, nobody's going to believe you, right? You're going to say, this is going to be an engaging webinar. You need to come prepared to engage and things like that. And people have heard it before and then shown up to the LinkedIn post I posted, right? Where then, oh, this is going to be engaging, interactive session. And by interactive, I mean, at one point in the session, I'm going to ask a question and see if anybody responds. So naturally, you're going to set some expectations. The first time it happens, people are not going to believe it. I mean, I can think of multiple times where when we've started something, you set expectations, people still didn't come prepared for it. And I think that's that comfort with failure and being like, all right, well, we didn't get everybody today, but it's the first time we did it. I think, again, going back to the acceptance piece, it's an opportunity for us to do that. Have you ever had a session just completely tank? Because I'm just curious if you've had one.
I've had, okay. So early on, 20-ish years ago, there were a couple of sessions that were really hard. We've intentionally put ourselves in front of the hardest audiences that we can find over and over again, ask them to put crosshairs on us from multiple angles and define the return on investment very, very clearly. So we are very comfortable going into hard audiences and working. Once again, it's all about respecting the medium. So it's not to say that we haven't had challenging classes. We've had challenging groups of people. There are some people who are more one side of the brain versus another side of the brain. And, I want to be careful not to generalize too much, yet, there are more analytically thinking, thought-minded people than, gregarious people. And so you just have to, like the medium, respect where they're coming from, honor where they're coming from. And ultimately, to be engaged is to be engaging, just like to be interested is to be interesting. So if our focus is outward and really looking at who's engaging and who's not engaging, especially in the types of programs that we put together, we can pick and choose and match and find people and get that type of 100% engagement, 100% participation from 100% of the people with whom we're engaging at any given time.
Okay.
A couple of examples with the virtual work that we do that come to mind is one of the things that we did learn pretty early on is that there's typically in a group of like 20 or 25, there's typically going to be a couple, like one or two, who just absolutely refuse to turn their webcam on.
Yeah.
And we could literally spend the whole session being like, hey, Jim, turn your webcam on. We know it's not on. We know you're on the session. Turn it on. 10 minutes of content later, be like, what do you think, Jim? Put your webcam on and tell us. And instead, it's like, again, we just make the assumption. Yeah, we make the assumption that if they're not turning their webcam on, there's a reason why.
Yeah.
And if it is something that is controllable, like I don't want my webcam on, and I'm just making this choice, we can't control that. Like that is, we just have to. We have to focus on the people who do turn their webcam on.
Yeah.
And the people who, and hope that in seeing this session that eventually Jim will turn his webcam on, or that next time he'll be like, I'll be ready for that. And I'll want to do it. And one funny story is last fall, we have one of our offerings is a asynchronous program that we have. That's an online learning program. And when we were piloting it last year with a pilot session, in our very first session, as I was like running the tech on the back end and Bob was running the content part of the session, we had like parts where everyone was on camera, and we had parts where we wanted people to chime in. And I would go through on the software we're using, I would go through and turn on everyone's webcam and everyone's mic, really without their knowledge. Cause it was my really, I'm new to this technology. We had switched technologies and I was really comfortable with the other one, and we're in a new one. And I'm like, we'll do this. And all of a sudden it's like someone's at a deli and there's all these things going on in the background. I was like, well, not okay. We're going to ask people to turn their microphones off
We're not
next
going to
time.
force this on them.
Well, no, it didn't even force. It was like, I'm going to go through and push the button on my end. You're up, but good, that's a lot of background noise. Oh, that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
So, but that was a learning on my part of it. Was like I've gone back and watched the video, and I'm like, that is painful. And like knowing what I know now and knowing how we approach it now, it's like, yeah, we'll do what we can. We'll do what's in our control in hopes that people are going to see that this is not some level of danger that they're putting themselves into.
Right.
You know, it's a learning curve. And once you get past that first hurdle, you realize how much easier it is. It's really not a big deal.
On those, right, the things you're talking about, which completely ring true, is the fact that not everything is going to go according to plan. I actually, based on our previous conversation, I did look up the Mike Tyson quote we were joking about, right? Where you have a plan till you get punched in the face. And that's the reality of it. And some people just aren't going to engage. And I think back to my early days of virtual, how much time I wasted, trying to troubleshoot the one person who could not figure out how to get their audio connected, and the poor, 20 other people sitting in there as you're going, and no, click the mic, no, click the mic, no, try, no, not that mic. Okay,
I don't have that on mine.
And you're like, why am I doing this? I just destroyed the experience for everyone else versus just maybe sending a direct message to the person who couldn't do it and just say, hey, looks like you're having some challenges, either join the session later or, we'll do a makeup or get you the content at some other point. But I can't, we can't bring down the entire group to save the 1% that just can't factor in. Sometimes that can be hard, right? Because we're trying, and that is a limitation of the tech. I think that is an adjustment for people going to virtual, is if you're in the classroom, you can do something about it. You can actually walk over and solve their problem. Here.
Yeah. Well, and actually what's interesting about that too, and another kind of a learning experience for us, is when we're doing virtual programs with clients, in the beginning, it would be our instructor who would be delivering the content, and they'd also be in charge of the tech as well. So they're like, because we put people in breakout rooms, it is to your question or point earlier, it's super experiential. And then, it's like, I have slides. So it's really, you're going to enjoy that. And there's a chat box too. But for us, it's very, like, we do make people move around a lot. They're having one-on-ones with new and different people. So it keeps it fresh. And that's part of our process. And we learned pretty early on, the feedback we're getting from our instructors is it was really hard to stay focused on the content when they were also in charge of the tech. So now we have someone in the back end for every session. So we have one person running content and we have one person running tech. And it works really, really well. It makes such a difference to the experience of both the instructor and also the participants when those things just move fluidly. And you're able to just say, and now we're going to breakout, and boom, everyone goes to breakout. And then you come back and you're able to really move kind of seamlessly.
Yeah. I remember when I first started doing breakout stuff, because that used to be, that was a new feature at one point. Now I think most people just see that as normal, but at the time it was a new feature. And I remember learning some very hard lessons in the beginning. You're like, all right, and we're going to do a breakout. And then you realize you got to get everybody in the break. Yeah. The poor people are sitting there. And this goes back to everything in virtual is just exacerbated. So, like in the classroom, you can kind of pivot and whatever, make some animal balloons, and everybody doesn't pay attention to the fact that you're kind of winging it right now. In the virtual setting, it doesn't really work that way. And you kind of just have to develop a comfort with that. But I remember the first time doing breakouts, and I'm sorry to anybody if you're watching and you were in my first class, because I remember it was like 10 minutes of stuff. And at the time, people called in and they had a different name. So they actually had a phone number. And so their voice was in one breakout room and they were in another breakout room. And you're like, what just happened? So there is some tremendous value to, if you have the luxury of having that extra person. I completely agree. Whenever I've ramped up with my teams on, how do we do virtual? Well, that is always just you have to have it, because you need that person that can remove the barriers for the facilitator to do it. Sometimes, and I'm sure there are people watching that go, we don't have those kind of resources. We might not have to do that. Well, okay. I mean, you can, then practice.
And keep it simple.
Keep it simple. Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes you hear and it goes back to the tech stuff, right? There's tons of features in these new things. And so sometimes people's first virtual session, like, we're going to do breakouts and we're going to have 37 different sessions and we're going to have 9 different facilitators and a different facilitator in each breakout. And then we're going to come back and debrief with the whiteboard. And you're like, that's your first one. Wow.
Mm.
So yeah, I agree with you on that one, Bob, that, keeping it simple can really
Yeah.
help if you don't have that luxury. I think the other thing, and I'm curious how you balance this. So I'll ask you, this one. We talked a little bit about how one of the challenges with the virtual piece is that a lot of times you show up to it and, it's death by PowerPoint. It just inevitably is death by PowerPoint. And I've got a bit of a perspective on how we can kind of get around that, but how have you balanced that content with experience piece? Because that is, I think sometimes this is a big problem, is we over index on delivering content in the live session, and it can really disrupt things. So how have you worked through that?
Whether in any capacity, through any medium, to me, the slides are there to support what you're doing. So that's our approach. We teach people how to ride a bicycle, and it's this specific bicycle. And that means, it's not PowerPoints that's going to teach you how to ride a bicycle or reading it in an article. It's get on the bike and learn how to ride this specific bicycle so you can use it ultimately. So we streamline our slides. Our slides are there to support the experiential learning and hit the impact points as well. If it's something that needs to go on there, it's kind of slide making 101. Reduce it. It shouldn't be 1,000 words on the slide, 12-point font where everybody's like, what are you doing? Going cross-eyed reading it. It's a couple of quick bullets, and I create support around that if really the content's that important. Send it as a pre-read. Be familiar with this ahead of time, or send it in post. I'm gonna clean all this up and make it a nice, neat package for you and send it after the fact. For right now, though, it's this is a communication tool that's meant for people. Yes. And I think that's a challenge that a lot of people have, that they come on and they're presenting their content over and over again. They're like, I'm reporting out to you. And I would question if this is the right medium for that.
Yeah. Go for it, Josh.
Oh, I was going to say, I had a colleague who used to call that PowerPoint karaoke. They're just like, reading off of a slide, and it's like, no one wants to see that. And to add on to what Bob was saying, and in a lot of our sessions, it's also breaking up the content in different mediums. So there's PowerPoint, and then there's times where the person sharing it goes off. We have one we'll go on grid so that we can see everybody and have that type of interaction. And then we do, we are able to utilize like the chat box and things like that. And there's that type of, it's not just, the slides are not just outwardly focused. Like it's just as much of a discussion maker as it is of just trying to regurgitate content or try to package it in some way so that people are just being constantly fire hosed at with content. Because that's, for adults and for kids, I mean, we don't learn that way. It's not the way that we learn best, of just having content thrown at us. It's, the right packaging of content, and then the usability aspect of it, and how to make it tangible so it's not just theory, and how do you then use that in practice. And that's what we try to do in these sessions that we're talking about, where it's introducing concepts and then putting people through experiences that help them use that, and then debriefing on it and talking about why we did that, and then going back to the slide.
Yeah. The thing with it is that, and sometimes this has been misinterpreted. People have misinterpreted this about me, that I'm opposed to the classroom, or that I think we shouldn't do that. And I don't think that's it at all. But I will say that live delivery of content is realistically one of the most inefficient ways we can do it, right? And I think we all know that. And it doesn't mean, right, because sometimes people go to the extreme and they're like, well, then don't put any content in there, and that's a true flipped classroom. Are there opportunities where you can say, yeah, let's just pull it all out? Yes. I think sometimes it's a matter of finding that right balance of what is the right, how do you actually do it well? Because again, if you're going through 50 minutes of PowerPoint slides, nobody's walking out of there with anything. And the reality with it is that people don't process information at the same pace at all. And that's, to me, that's always been one of the limitations of classroom, whether it's in person or virtual, is when you use it as a content delivery mechanism, you're treating everyone as though they have to kind of follow the same pace. And I just know, even from my K-12 days, I mean, no student learns at the same pace. And so, the pushback I'll get from people is, well, if we send it to them ahead of time, then they won't go through it. And okay, I think there's something that can be said for that. I think there's different ways you can get it out there, and there is a balancing act of, okay, well, where do you find the right level of stuff? But realistically, I think what I've seen over the years is the way you make virtual classrooms as effective as possible is by making them about connecting with people, collaborating, solving problems, talking through things, discussing things like that. If you're doing that, that actually makes it easier, going back to your point earlier, Bob, of making it easier as a facilitator, because your job is no longer to keep everybody engaged on slide 37, bullet point 46. Like, well, of course you're struggling to keep everybody engaged because it's tough. So I think you're spot on in terms of let's really look at how do we keep people talking? How do we keep people collaborating and connecting and doing that kind of stuff in the virtual classroom versus how do we tell them as much information as possible?
You mentioned intentionality before, and I think it goes right back to that, because one of the buzzwords right now is Zoom fatigue. And that to me it's almost a little mind-boggling that that's where we all are right now, because it means we're not being thoughtful about, if we're in back-to-back Zoom meetings, the question is why? Are they all needed to communicate, collaborate with each other, bond with each other, connect with each other, look at each other? Or should we be mixing up the mediums a little bit? At what point is a phone call back in play? Because that's a pretty good way to communicate with each other as well. And so as it relates to design or relates to medium, it goes back to, what you mentioned before. Just put a little thoughtfulness behind it, and that can go a really long way.
Yeah. The Zoom fatigue one cracks me up, though. Not cracks me up like in a ha-ha sense, but in like a sense, in that I do think some of it is, and this has nothing necessarily to do with the it not necessarily has to do with the oh shoot, now I totally blanked on that one. The intentionality is the fact that I think some of it has to do with people really uncomfortable with not being able to see the people they're working with. And so they're just packing meetings to like hopefully make sure that they're staying on top of things. And I think that is contributing to the Zoom fatigue, where it's like, hey, you didn't have people in meetings all day, every day before. Why do you need to have team meetings and one-on-one meetings with your team all day now just because you can't see what they're doing? So I do think there is that trust, which has, again, nothing to do with virtual learning necessarily, but I think it's something we need to be mindful of, again, with the intentionality. If we're pulling people together, and I think this is true in person or virtual, if we're pulling people together for something and asking for them and their live time and their mind share, we better have a really damn good reason why we're doing it. And we better think about that and think about what do we want on the other end of that, because people's time is valuable. And there are a lot of ways we can get people information or get their input or their feedback in a way that allows them to do it when it's best for them. And anything you do live is, well, this is best for all of us. So you better make sure it's the right stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how about some other stuff? What other war stories have you seen where you thought something? I'm just curious on your end. What are some lessons you've learned other than the one? I love the lessons of the breakout stuff, but or turning everybody's cameras on. That to me,
that was a good one.
Reminds me of some of the Zoom fails I've seen on YouTube recently, where people just didn't realize their camera was on. Have you had any other big ones, or even small?
Oh man.
You have people walk away from the camera sometimes in a virtual classroom. They just kind of like walk off, and they'll come back with a cup of coffee. Or in a recent academic setting, somebody came back with a beer, and I was like,
wow.
It's 7 o'clock at night, so I guess it's happy hour. It's 5 o'clock somewhere. 7 o'clock on the East Coast. I guess that would be Mountain Time. Hard to tell. So I think there's just, as we continue to get more comfortable with this, and with that, I think we become more intentional with it as well, then I think there's going to be a greater sense of awareness of, I might be wrong, with the comfort, there could be a lack of awareness that now it's just so second nature. However, it seems to me that there's a learning curve that we're in right now.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say, that I find interesting is the last couple of weeks or months as we've been doing sessions and working with people in a virtual setting, and you have like the grid view up and you're watching these individuals, and it's more about thinking like what exactly was going through your mind, knowing that your video is on. But like we had a session recently where there was this, and like, you know, it's someone who's very clearly texting, and it's like your camera is on, and like your boss is in this session too, and it just went on and on and on and on. And it's one of those sessions. It's one of those things of seeing that and realizing that there's still a lot. There's a lot for people to learn about the etiquette. You know, being in the etiquette. Exactly, being in the meeting and like knowing that there are things that have to change. I think any war story that I have is not necessarily client focused. It's just the day-to-day of both being a dad and working out of the house and the challenges that causes. That the three of us collectively could probably do an entire session just sharing jokes and stories about how ridiculous it can be.
Yeah.
And have been doing this for years, you know, and now it feels like one of those things where you see these stories coming up on Twitter or social media about working from home with kids, and the initial impulse is to be like, yeah, that I had that one 5 years ago. And instead it's more like, how can I help this person?
Yeah.
Like what can I, you know, what if they're looking for advice or whatever that might be, of being like, yeah, that happens. That's a fun one. That's a really good one. And here's XYZ of types of things that I've done with that in mind.
Well, and going back to the expectation setting, I think that's an important one, because the intentionality behind it is really, really important, because again, it's not just people's natural to think about, and I think to set that expectation, you have to set it with your participants. Think about, if I was in a meeting or if I was in a classroom right now, would I do this? Like just, maybe we need to have a little tagline, would I do this in a meeting type thing, that's just like, would you? I mean, and some of them, this is where there's the bad side, but then sometimes there's the other side that people don't take into account, where it's like, well, if you really had to go to the bathroom in a meeting, wouldn't you just push your chair back, quietly step up, walk out of the room, and then come back when you were done? Yeah, that's what you would do, because that's etiquette. So you have to tell people it's okay to do that in a virtual meeting too. Right. People are sitting there, kind of doing the dance, like, and you're like, go, it's okay. It's totally okay. But if we don't give people that permission, then it leaves them to kind of make that decision on their own. And even the person texting, it sounds like the person texting doing it, it wasn't just like, oh, I got a message, I need to quick check this and then I'll go back to it. So a little bit different. But again, I've had ones where, I've actually had to tell people in sessions, if an important phone call comes in, put yourself on mute. Turn off your camera if you need to. Step away for a minute. Maybe put in the chat, BRB or something to just let me know, need a minute, so that I don't accidentally call on you and go into the black hole of, Bob type of thing. Right. But again, just have some ground rules around, hey, this is the way we run the session. These are the things that you can do. These are the things that we would encourage you not to do. And then be okay with the fact that somebody's not going to read it. Somebody's not going to pay attention, and then just be okay with that. Or I'm good at the security settings.
I think, we're hitting a couple of themes here, which is the vulnerability aspect of being, learning this process, the confidence needed to be okay when people are doing things that might not fall in line with what we want, even when we set the expectations properly. And something that I don't think we've hit, if we not quite as hard as possible we should, empathy. Understanding that people are grappling with a lot of different stuff, including the headspace part of this whole thing. And it comes in waves, and there's different challenges at any given time. And so if it's not directly in line with where we would behave in a meeting, because I love that setting of like, would you do this in a real meeting? Well, there's got to be a point as well that we step back and say like, okay, maybe in a real meeting, if my son fell off of a chair and you needed to run out, or my son, your son, whoever it might be, we'd be like, okay, I get it. Thanks for telling me, communicating it. It's not this, though, that you're talking to me and I just go, walk off for no reason. Right. It's figuring out that balance, and in that, the empathy and the learning curve all has to be part of the picture.
Yeah. Right. And that's any best, like any of the best practices we have, and it's not a panacea. You know,
No.
it's not something. There are times and places where this will not work, and
Yep.
there are times when you have to be forgiving, or you have to just seek forgiveness of being like, I can't have my video on right now because my 4-year-old is not wearing clothes and I don't know where my wife is and he's in the room and I'm not going to be on video. Sorry. Or whatever, whatever it might be. Or if I have to use the restroom, like, go use the restroom. That's fine. So there has to be this flexibility that has to exist for yourself and for everyone around you, and knowing that you can't just read some list and think like, well, no, you have to do it that way. It has to be this way every single time, or we're not going to succeed. It's like, that's not what we do in real life. That's not what we do in live settings. We have a structure, we have a rules of engagement, and there also have to be gray areas where we have to be able to be flexible when needed.
Yeah. What's interesting about that, right? We started this session on, hey, we're going to talk about some best practices. And honestly, ending the session, probably one of the biggest takeaways anybody listening can take is there is no top 10 list of you must always do these things. There's best practices because, they're best practices. Is it good to have cameras on? Sure. Because you know what? You can actually see and connect with people. Have there been times I've killed everybody's camera because it was just too distracting with the number of people and people were not necessarily paying attention? Yep, I've done it and said, you know what, this doesn't make sense right now. We're going to kill cameras so we can really focus on this. We'll bring them back up, for this type of thing. Lots of these things where it's like, well, are there times that you need to deliver content? Sure. Are there times you have no business even having a PowerPoint slide in the virtual session and just have a discussion? Yeah. I mean, yeah. And I think that goes back to what's interesting is kind of the specialty you focus on with improv and business improv is you have to do this well. You have to be able to adapt and flex. And honestly, the way we kicked this meeting off was a perfect example. We go live, 2 of the live stream things broke. We had to quick cancel it, reset the thing up, join, and then just go with it. And, instead of getting hung up on it didn't quite work the way we thought, so we're just going to cancel the whole thing and, just hang our heads. You just go, well, all right, didn't work how we thought. We'll pivot.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit it right on the head. Right now, everybody's got to pivot. Everybody's got to be adaptable. And the reacting nature of adaptability as we continue to find our way through this whole thing, and then talk to each other, communicate. Yeah.
The last one I think that we can kind of wrap out, unless there's any other things you want to really highlight with this, is, I've often heard people say, well, there's just some things that can't be done virtually. And I posted about this a few weeks ago, and I would challenge anybody who says that, like, send me a message on LinkedIn. We'll chat for a bit, because my whole thing with it is, are there certain activities that can't be done in person or it can't be done virtually? Sure. Right. If you're having whatever, I won't get into examples. Are there certain
have surgery virtually?
Yeah. Like, I don't want to have a virtual surgery and
now take the scalpel and make the incision.
Now do this to yourself. Like, I don't want to do that. But, I think the biggest thing with it is when you look at outcomes and you say, okay, at the end of the day, what are we really trying to achieve with this? So if this was an activity that we did, maybe we can't do that activity the way we did before. But if the ultimate outcome of that activity was to get people to do XYZ or understand XYZ or solve XYZ problem, then let's figure out what are some ways that we can do that in the classroom. Because I've worked with lots of teams where before they've just been like, well, we can't do this activity. We just strip it out. And you're like, whoa, what are you doing? Because if it was that easy to strip out, why were you doing it in the first place? But then if you think really through the redesign, and I'm sure with what you've done with Business Improv, I have to imagine there were things where you said, well, we can't quite do that activity, but we can achieve this outcome. Would you agree? Absolutely.
But the exercises that we do on site, though we might find some root in the same thing, have to be adapted to fit inside this medium. Once again, you have to honor and respect this specific medium. And so Anybody who says that you can't do something virtually, sure, there are some limitations like surgery. At the same time, it's people are looking too close-minded. You're looking at reasons you can't succeed as opposed to possibility and potential. And frankly, the reasons we have to figure out how to succeed in this environment. And right now, that connection process is should it not only be wanted, it's needed. A lot of people need to connect with each other, and we have to figure out how to do it in this capacity. So look for possibility, look for potential, and look for opportunity to adjust it, manipulate it, adapt it, bastardize it, make it work inside this medium so that ultimately it does work inside this medium.
Yeah. This is our nature as people and humans. We tell ourselves that something can't work. It'll never work. We can't do that. And then someone does it and you're like, oh, okay, we'll do that. Yeah, we'll do that. And that's so much of this is, I think if we were having a conversation, we talked about this in the last time we had a conversation. If we were having this conversation like 6 months ago and talking about how all of corporate America could go digital tomorrow, it'd be like, that is ridiculous. No way could that possibly happen. And it's like, yeah, COVID-19 is like, hold my beer, watch this. So ultimately there's so much that if you tell yourself it'll never work and you just stay siloed on that one thing, you are right.
You're 100% right.
You're 100% right. If that's where your focus is, if that's what you want to happen, if that's what you're convinced is going to happen, congratulations. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's going to come through. And instead, if you kind of reframe it and think differently about how could this look or what could this look like, what are we ultimately trying to achieve in this activity that we don't believe can be virtual? I guarantee there are at least a couple of things that you can hit, that you can have that experience, maybe not completely mimic the live experience. Parts of it, though, the important parts could. Yep. And that's where the focus has to be, is like, what can we do? How can we make this work? Instead of just focusing on, we can't do that, we're not going to do it, and like on to the next thing. If it's that, like to your point, if it's that important, focus on it.
Right. Well, and I think, that's one thing that's come out of this whole thing is, I think for a long time, it's been here's all the reasons we can't do it. And there wasn't really an incentive to do it. In many regards, even though it was much needed. I think a lot of organizations are now realizing, like, why did we wait so long to do more of this? Like, why? I'm even hearing conversations now where even business being done virtually is starting to change, where people are going, why didn't we start thinking about this differently before this whole crisis? And I think this is a unique opportunity for people to kind of start embracing that in this time where right now you don't have a choice. Sorry. Yeah. Like it's not a matter of, well, we can't. Well, you're going to have to, unless you're just not going to do anything. So, well,
that's dangerous.
That is dangerous, right? That will come back to bite you. So definitely would not encourage people to take that path. All right. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation again. Hopefully everybody who's tuning in has gotten something valuable out of this, and definitely send questions, send things like that. We'll add in the comments the hack sheet that we've put together. Again, just keep in mind, these are tips that you're going to need to put some critical thought and application behind. And, if you want additional context or stories, don't hesitate to reach out. We've got a lot of experience on this call here with people who have been in the trenches and taken some wounds along the way. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining again, Bob and Josh, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.